Now that I've thoroughly embarrassed myself by showing you the first and worst conlang I've ever made, I think it's only appropriate for me to demonstrate that I have, in fact, improved since then. At least slightly. Today we're looking at Oqolaawak, a language I first began work on in 2015, and that went through 3 different iterations before I got it to a place I like. Of all my conlangs, it's the oldest one that I still feel lives up to standards that I hold myself to today. Now, there are many languages within the Oqolaawak family, but we'll be focusing on the classical dialect for simplicity. Classical Oqolaawak is a predominantly fusional, strongly head-initial and consistently head-marking language, featuring object marking, noun classes, and a love of idiomatic and figurative language. Or, to put it a different way, A Oqolaawak e te Oqolaawak e zoe I makayu she mawelamanko makipiamanko lachamak tsulihim. Kumi achikikwi fahiu pepetek mafi hamachi hawanna, shache pokua pe soa she mechlawi, iminia tsa koi matete nia eteu tsotsonwa, koitewa islatunwa tatajwe. As you might have been able to tell from that sample, classical Oqolaawak's phonetic inventory includes the uvular stop, the lateral fricative, and no phonemic voice obstruents, although sibilant fricatives are voiced when occurring between voiced segments. While Proto-Oqolaawak had an exclusively open syllable structure, classical Oqolaawak allows the occasional consonant cluster, geminates, and word final coders. Of all of Oqolaawak's phonotactic rules, the most notable are its 2 concomitant harmony systems. Oqolaawak features a pretty simple vowel harmony system based on height. High and low vowels cannot co-occur within the same word, with a couple of exceptions. This means that most affixes have 2 forms, one for stems that contain high vowels and one for those with low vowels. However, the vowel R is considered neutral and can coexist with either set. Oqolaawak also features sibilant harmony, meaning that among sibilants, alveolars and palatoalveolars cannot appear in the same word, and so, just like with the vowels, the realization of any sibilants in a given affix will depend on the phonology of the stem. Stress in classical Oqolaawak is based on vowel mora. An open syllable with a short vowel is treated as a single mora, while a syllable is considered 2 mora if it contains a long vowel or diphthong, or is closed, and is considered 3 mora if it contains a long vowel or a diphthong and is closed. Stress always falls on the 3rd mora from the end of the word. Oqolaawak uses the Ilwa script, which is most often written in ink with an animal hair brush on parchment. In terms of system, it's probably easiest to think of it as an alphabet with an inherent vowel, and the simplest way to wrap your head around that is with a little history. Back in the days of Proto-Oqolaawak, the Oqolaaw first learned to write from the Kama peoples, who had already had their own writing system for quite a while. Their script had started out as a logography written by carving glyphs into trees with obsidian knives, but eventually it simplified into an abjad using logographs to represent the first sound of the word they depicted. When the Oqolaaw first borrowed the abjad, they already had access to ink, dyes, and other pigments, so it wasn't long before the script was adapted for being written on papyrus scrolls, which resulted in the distinctive orthogonal shapes of the Tsapukama abjad becoming more curvilinear. However, in adapting the Tsapukama system to their own language, the Oqolaaw faced a number of technical challenges. First and foremost, Oqolaawak and Tsapukama are entirely unrelated languages and thus have very, very different phonologies. Tsapukama only has 3 vowels, which its abjad has no difficulty representing, since I could also be written with Y, and U could be written with W. And since Tsapukama doesn't allow consonant clusters, the speakers know that whenever 2 consonants are written next to each other, there must be an unwritten R vowel in there. Oqolaawak, however, has 5 vowels, so when it borrowed the Tsapukama system, it had no way of representing E and O. However, Tsapukama's consonant inventory is much larger than Oqolaawak's, and includes some much more exotic sounds. Since the Oqolaaw had no need to represent these sounds in their script, they decided to repurpose these characters for the few sounds that Oqolaawak has that Tsapukama doesn't provide symbols for, like using the Ta glyph for Sla, Ha for O, and Ka for E. However, they still kept the character for the R vowel implicit, as was done in Tsapukama, which they could afford to do because Proto-Oqolaawak was also exclusively CV. The only exception to this is if the word begins with an R. T'Apukama simply didn't bother writing an initial A, but the Oqolaawak felt this was necessary to transcribe, so they used the character for the glottal stop, which in Proto-Oqolaawak wasn't phonemic word initially, and later on in history it was lost entirely. So this character represents R, but only at the beginning of words. Everywhere else, R is unwritten. This system worked fine, for a while, but then, in the transition to classical Oqolaawak, the language went through a period of vowel loss, so now, when two consonants are written next to each other, it's unclear whether they form a cluster, or whether there's an unwritten R between them. To resolve this ambiguity, the scribes decided to introduce a diacritic to tell the reader that the consonant does not, in fact, have a vowel following it. So the result of all this is a system where an individual consonant is assumed to be followed by an R, unless it's overtly followed by another vowel character, or unless it's marked with a diacritic. The system also has some additional punctuation, mostly derived from poetic notation. Rather than using separate numerals, numbers are transcribed using the first sound in the word for the number, and preceded by this symbol. In Proto-Oqolaawak, this character represented the H sound, borrowed directly from the T'Apukama character of the same pronunciation. However, in the transition to classical Oqolaawak, a cascade of sound changes took place that threw everything out of whack. First of all, H was lost in all environments, lengthening any sound that came before it. Then, to fill the void, the velar fricative ch weakened to h in all environments, and then the aspirated velar stop k replaced ch. This meant the characters for all of these sounds shifted, but now the old character for h no longer makes any sound at all, but rather, since the loss of H lengthened the preceding sound, this soundless character was later reanalyzed as an iteration marker, and is now used to transcribe both geminates and long vowels, even in words that historically didn't have an H. And, as a final note, when later dialects developed phonemic voiced obstruents, they invented another diacritic to mark them. So as you can probably tell, the Oqolaawak have actually been pretty good at keeping their spelling up to date, so most words will be pronounced how you'd expect them to be pronounced from their spelling. Though, again, there are a couple of exceptions. When discussing Oqolaawak grammar, the first and most important thing to do is to familiarize yourself with its noun class system. Way back in Proto-Oqolaawak, there was a system of classifiers that could be used as indefinite articles and pronouns. Over time, though, these classifiers got inextricably linked with the words they co-occurred with, becoming class suffixes on nouns and agreement markers on verbs and prepositions. In the time of classical Oqolaawak, all nouns are sorted into one of 5 noun classes that form a loose animacy hierarchy. So going from lowest animacy to highest, we start with the ethereal class, which includes abstractions, concepts, emotions, and verbal nouns. Elemental nouns are mostly inanimate, naturally occurring objects, like rocks, plants, and places. Material nouns constitute a whole grab bag of different nouns, including, but not limited to, animate natural phenomena, body parts, instruments, and certain very low animacy animals. Almost all kinetic nouns are animals, but not all animals are kinetic nouns. Finally, the exalted class comprises humans, deities, spirits, and certain culturally important animals. The most obvious reification of the class system comes in the form of an obligatory suffix on all nouns that also encodes plurality. Depending on the noun class, Oqolaawak distinguishes up to 4 different grammatical numbers: singular, dual, paucal, and plural. Nouns are also marked for definiteness by way of a simple word final suffix derived from an old demonstrative. Possessed nouns are appended with a prefix that agrees with their possessor in person, number, and class. There are 2 forms of possessive prefix, one for alienable possession and one for inalienable possession. The alienable set are also used for marking prepositions, which agree with their objects in person, number, and class. In Proto-Oqolaawak, almost all prepositions were derived from nouns forming genitival constructions. When the possessive pronouns became nominal prefixes, the nouns being used as prepositions inherited them as agreement morphology. And, in fact, the inalienable prefixes evolved from a separate inflecting preposition that later got glommed onto its object. Since Oqolaawak has no case marking, it uses these inflecting prepositions for the majority of non-core role marking, but also for things like comparatives and superlatives. Verbs take a suffix that frame it in one of three tenses: perfect, imperfect, and future. This same tense suffix also agrees with the subject in person, number, and class. In a transitive sentence, the verb also takes an additional suffix to mark the direct object. However, if the direct object is overtly stated within the clause, then the suffix is omitted. For more complex or specific tense aspect encodings, Oqolaawak makes frequent use of three auxiliary verbs: the copula, the locative copula, and an old verb that can no longer be used as an independent word, but used to mean something like to leave. As you might expect, all three of these auxiliaries are irregular, mainly due to them preserving defunct conjugations. For example, in Proto-Oqolaawak, the standard way of forming the perfect was by reduplicating the first syllable of the unmarked verb, which was interpreted as the imperfect. However, later on, a verb with the meaning of to finish got used as an auxiliary to encode the cessative aspect, then got suffixed onto the lexical verb and became the standard perfect suffix. The reduplicated perfect was lost in all verbs except the copula and the locative copula, which were used frequently enough to resist adopting the new pattern. Meanwhile, for the future copula, a different root, meaning to become, was used, which then became incorporated into the same paradigm by suppletion. By the way, the auxiliary constructions are split-headed, so the subject marker gets suffixed to the auxiliary, and the direct object goes onto the lexical verb. There are a couple of other frequently used auxiliaries that convey modal information, while verbs are negated by way of a following particle. Adjectives are very transparently derived from verbs. When used predicatively, they behave exactly like verbs, while when used attributively, the tense suffix is removed to form what's called the simple stem, to which the subject markers are suffixed. The simple stem is also used when nominalizing verbs, which can be achieved by applying a class suffix to the simple stem, with the meaning depending on which noun class the verb stem is rendered in. On the subject of derivation, although Oqolaawak doesn't compound too often, it is very fond of dvandvas, creating compounds by combining two nouns with opposite meanings. And while it's not as productive these days as it was in Proto-Oqolaawak, reduplication is used for a variety of purposes, particularly for intensives and eventatives. While the grammar is quite straightforward in many ways, the hardest elements of Oqolaawak for a non-native speaker to master are in the way it handles discourse, mainly stemming from its animacy-dependent syntax. If we were to literally translate a sentence like, "The coconut hit the warrior in the face," it would technically be grammatical, but it would sound a bit strange. Unless you're trying to emphasize a particular element, the nouns in a standard sentence are expected to come in order of animacy as delineated by the noun classes, so we'd need to rearrange the nouns accordingly. However, the sentence still needs to fit the default VSO word order, so to ensure nouns can fulfill these roles and simultaneously maintain the order of animacy, Oqolaawak uses a series of voicing tricks and valency-changing operations. Firstly, as an exalted noun, the warrior needs to come first and must therefore be the subject, which we can achieve by passivizing the verb. Then comes the material noun, face, which we could render as part of a prepositional phrase, but actually, it would probably be more intuitive to a native speaker to use an applicative construction. Oqolaawak has a series of applicative suffixes that promote the object of a particular type of prepositional phrase to a direct object. These applicatives are actually derived from old inflecting prepositions that got suffixed onto the verb stem. In this case, we can use the locative applicative to modify the verb to mean to strike against, and then use the noun face as what is functionally a direct object. Finally, the coconut is placed last and preceded by an instrumental preposition, so the whole sentence more literally translates to, "The warrior was struck against their face with the coconut." This might seem a bit clunky, but in fact, this would actually be the most natural way for a native Oqolaawak speaker to say a sentence like this. Finally, let's talk about one of the trickiest, but also one of the funnest things about Oqolaawak: register and figurative language. Oqolaawak is very sensitive to formality, which is primarily indicated by a whole bevy of second-person pronouns, but more indirectly by what are known as the animal registers. Without getting too much into cultural stuff, the Oqolaawak have a mythology largely centered around animal worship. In their folk stories, there's a recurring cast of animals that each have their own personality archetype, as well as a characteristic way of speaking. So to imply someone has a specific personality trait, one uses the speech pattern of the animal that exemplifies that trait. It's kind of like how in English we might, however unfair it may be, put on a particular accent when impersonating someone to emphasize a certain attribute. Similarly, Oqolaawak makes ample use of proverbs and cultural expressions. Since the Oqolaawak are a predominantly seafaring culture, many of their idioms and cultural metaphors have to do with sailing or navigation. The Oqolaawak lexicon is also chock full of idiophones, many of which are tied to specific registers. There are also a host of discourse particles that I like to think of as verbal punctuation, including a sentence initial word that turns any statement into a yes or no question. Mastering the subtle shades of meaning supplied by all of these components of discourse is notoriously tricky for non-native speakers, which may be part of the reason why classical Oqolaawak maintains such a strong reputation of exoticism and mystery as it was spread across the ocean and mingled with the far-flung languages of other lands, producing the innumerable dialects and creoles that came to exist in later ages. So, those are some of the main points worth mentioning about Oqolaawak, or at least as many as can fit in one video of reasonable length. I hope you got something out of it, and let me know if you want to see more videos like this, because there's plenty more where that came from. Until then, Hushwaliti lamalu watan le pepewa.